Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast. I'm Jeremy. This is my good friend Haig, and our brother Shant is joining us for our second in a series of talks on the I am statements of Jesus. Last week, we explored the statement of Jesus where he says, I am the bread of life in John chapter 6. And now we're going to fast forward to John chapter 8, where Jesus stands up in a crowd again at another festival and says, I am the light of the world. I am the light of life. And he offers himself up to the people as such. So, guys, here we are in our second run.
Yeah.
What's different? Last week we talked about bread. Now we're talking about light.
Definitely different elements, but both essential, I would say.
Yeah, there you go. Well, there's a first crack at it. They're both essential. We're talking a lot about essential things at the moment, essential businesses and non-essential businesses.
Right.
So bread, light, those are both essential to living everyday life.
Yeah, especially these days where vitamin D
Yes.
is in a lack in most of people's lives. And they're saying that vitamin D is actually a way to
What you
combat
need.
coronavirus.
Yeah.
So it's
Do we
this
need to
irony.
insert a PSA here? Take your
Yeah.
vitamin D if you want to.
Right.
Just go outside. That's the moral of the story. Like just soak up some UV rays. But be careful in crowds.
Yeah. Let's talk about the theme of light in the Bible. Light is a common it's on the very first page of the Bible.
Right. Yeah. You can't discuss it without going all the way back to Genesis and seeing, God created and he said, let there be light. And that was kind of the first thing. And even in the beginning of John's gospel in the first chapter where he alludes to Genesis in the beginning, was the Word and the Word was with God. And again, in that first chapter, John even says the light came into the world, came into the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So I think you kind of get a hint of that, what Jesus is saying here, you get a hint of it in the first chapter of John, describing Jesus, the Logos, as the light as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually something I didn't get to say that first week. It just escaped me. But that first chapter of John, the introduction, it lays out the themes for the whole rest of the gospel. And, it lays out themes for the bread of life statement. We could have picked that up, but we're talking about light of life today, so we'll switch it to that. But that line, it's a really interesting line where in the intro, John says that the light shines in the darkness and the darkness has not overcome it. So that word for overcome in Greek, it can mean two different things. It can either mean to grasp something like mentally or cognitively, or it can literally mean to like grasp somebody, to choke them, to like end their life. So literally, it's a powerful word, and I think I prefer that second translation. So it's almost as if what John is saying is like the darkness tries to snuff it out and kill the light, and the light overcomes it. It's not grasped by it. It's not it's not destroyed by it, which foreshadows the violence that Jesus is going to meet as he goes to the cross.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just an interesting motif, just light versus darkness. It's there in almost any sort of story of good versus evil. The light side of the force, the dark side of the force.
Yeah.
You have these dualistic religions like Zoroastrianism. That's like the light versus the darkness. Like you have the light backgammon pieces versus the dark backgammon pieces, and they're playing this cosmic game of good versus evil. And Christianity has this motif. It's just saying that Jesus is the one who champions the cause of the light, and the darkness thinks it wins over the light, but actually the darkness did not overcome the one who is light.
Yeah, I think the bone that Christianity had to pick with like dualistic systems like Manichaeism and stuff like that was not that there was light and dark, but that in those systems, light and dark were equal, and and they were sort of just by the skin of your teeth, the light would win, or potentially the darkness would win, whether you let it or not. but I think the key to Christian faith and the gospel is that they are not equal partners, that God destroys the darkness and injustice and hate and sin of the world,
Yeah.
and still redeems the creation that is captured by it and enslaved by it.
Yeah, and the motif, I mean, in Genesis 1, right, God separates the light from the darkness.
Yeah.
And God is still separating light from darkness right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that, Jared, that you bring that up. It's kind of the idea is like we see it in other cultures or other religions about light versus dark, and it's this epic battle between the two and who's going to win. But Christianity says, no, it's obvious who's going to win. It just made me think of a memory back in our college days at CSUN. I took a world religions class, and before every section of whatever religion we were talking about, the professor would give kind of a quiz just to gauge like what the students knew about Hinduism or Buddhism or whatever. And during the Christianity one, he gave the little quiz and got back the results. And that was a surprising thing, myself as a Christian in that class, realizing that people actually thought like Satan and Jesus were equal, that the light and dark were equal, and it was just this epic battle. And the professor correctly stated, no, Christianity, Satan's time is limited. Satan is already defeated. He's just kind of running out the clock almost, and the victory is assured. And it was interesting to me that people didn't really understand that just on their cursory, view of the faith and about Christ. And I think here the image of light is very important because light dispels darkness. Like there's no place that you're going to have light that darkness is going to snuff it out, right? Just the actual like physics of it. Light just dispels darkness. It takes it away. It just makes it disappear. And I think that's what Jesus is claiming. He's the light.
Unless you pass by a black hole, and then you're screwed.
Well,
but what's inside the black hole?
Yeah, sure. But one of the things that's interesting as we talk about this is that many cultures, when they were involved in paganism, worshipped light, right? And so even the Armenian culture at one point, we were sun worshipers, we were light worshipers. And it's interesting how we as Christians, as the first Christian nation, as Armenians, took that theme of light and translated it. We Christianized it and made it, speak into the gospel. Like we used it as a way to talk about who God is and what God is doing in the world.
Yeah. And just from like a physics point of view, light is, the speed of light is a constant, right? Like it's cool that light has a characteristic of being a constant. And
isn't it also a wave and a particle, right?
Yeah.
Both. It's both.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not a direct comparison, but like Christ is like a God and man, but particle and a wave. And also he's our constant.
There you go.
That's a Sunday school lesson.
Fuzzy physics on
fuzzy physics.
On
we are in no way scientists, guys.
Yeah.
We are not scientists. Yes.
Disclaimer. So one of the things we're coming up on is light has some sort of revelatory function. So light reveals what's in the dark, right? And so there's a judgment language to light. When Jesus says, "I'm the light of the world," he's criticized again. I mean, we saw this back in the Bread of Life statement. He's criticized. He has conflict. He meets disagreement. But again, here he has the same. If you read chapter 8 all the way through to chapter 9. There's controversy, there's conflict, and it's because he's essentially saying you're living in darkness. You're living in a space that's become corrupted. You're practicing corruption. You're blind to what God is doing in the world, and I'm showing you that. In fact, in chapter 9, Jesus does a sign that actually drives home the point of being the light of the world. He takes a guy who's blind and he gives him light. It's like that's the sort of really powerful object lesson that Jesus performs to drive home the point. So, okay, we have light as a sort of revealing element, light as a victory over darkness, because it's often used in the Old Testament as a sign of victory. But what else I'm trying to think, what else is light symbolic of? Is there another symbol we're missing?
I think those are two big ones. And like you're saying, not just Jesus being that revelatory thing, but it impacts us, I think, in a personal way, right? He reveals us for who we are, reveals, our shortcomings. And it's like you said, there's that judgment aspect to it. But I think ultimately it's a way for Jesus to say, look, I see you as you are. Nothing's hidden from me about you, but there's still that connection, that there's still that his love and forgiveness is there, even though he knows every dirty little secret that you have. It's still, you still belong to him.
Right. It's I just thinking too, I think that light is often associated with purity too.
Right.
Right. So when someone is clothed with light, it's, it's an image of some like purity and some sort of,
Sure.
I mean, it's also just like it's used as God, right? God is light and everyone who walks with him will be light. So like that's in First John, which is a letter
Right.
that the Gospel of John, the author of the Gospel of John writes later on to his churches. One of the key points of that letter is that God is light and those who walk with him will live in his light. So they'll, like you said, Shant, they'll be
walking in the light.
Yeah.
Transparent, not hiding anything. And I think that's a call once we are followers of Jesus. That's the standard and the call that we have to walk in the light, to walk with Christ. And if we're walking with Christ, we're walking in the light. Nothing is hidden, and we try to be as transparent and as open, as we can. It's not an easy task, but that's what we're called to do if we're truly walking with him.
So the motif of light is also truth, because in the context of this passage, they're questioning his authority. What is true? How is what you're saying is accurate? And like even from like from Plato's point of view, right? The analogy of the cave. Those who are outside the cave, they're enlightened. They have higher access to the truth. So you have that sort of understanding, but Christianity's version of it is more of, are you walking in it? Are you with it? Are you honest? So it's not just knowledge, it's actually being honest with yourself and with God. And so oftentimes it's confess your sins. So the act of confessing your sins is walking in the light. It just, the word confession means acknowledging with what God already knows. Right, it's aligning yourselves with the light. It's being someone who's not going to have secrets, not going to participate in the darkness, but it's going to be honest, transparent with their sin, who they are, and just the light and being in the light, which is where God is, where there's honesty, where there's truth, where there's Christ and his spirit.
Right. I think I mentioned earlier, building on all of this, something that kind of marries all these themes together is the fact that Jesus is at a festival. And this festival is the Feast of Tabernacles. Some of them have sometimes it's called the Feast of Booths. But just to give some like historical background, this is a festival that the Jewish people would celebrate to remember the wilderness wanderings that we talked about in the first episode with the bread of life. So after Israel is purchased by God out of Egypt, redeemed out of Egypt and saved, they're brought into the wilderness and they wander there for 40 years. So it's a remembrance of being homeless, basically. And in the midst of that homelessness, they had the light of God. It was literally like a pillar of fire and smoke that would go ahead of them in the tabernacle and rest when they were supposed to stop. So all of these images, victory, direction, truth, guidance, provision, all of those things are kind of summarized in this thing of God is light. He's up there in the front, and Jesus is saying, I'm the one. Like I'm the leader of the people. I'm the light that's bringing you forward into the world. And it's all celebrated at this Feast of Tabernacles, and all these themes would have been playing through as the people are gathering. So again, just like last week, when Jesus gets up to say, I'm the light of the world, he's making a very controversial statement. He's basically saying this festival is about me, and I'm here to offer you everything that this festival claims to be offering.
Yeah, it has that both internal and external idea. Like you're saying, the festival celebrating or remembering the Jewish people time in the desert, and it was such an uncertain time for them, and God's presence was with them as light at night and as a cloud during the day to keep them from, the harshness of the sun. And yeah, like that light represents, okay, protection from the unknown. If it's at nighttime, you don't know what's out there, you don't know what's in the darkness. That light is an external, in a sense, showing you that it's protection, God's protection. And when we look at it in an internal way, then it reveals ourselves, our internal selves, which are just as dangerous as any external, threat that might be. But yeah, Jesus is declaring he's that light. And I think a lot of it is that, in a sense, he's that source of light too, right? He is that light. He's the source. He's the one that's shining over everything. He's the source of that light, and it comes from him. So we can look to Jesus for comfort in that sense, that he goes before us, like in the wilderness for the Jews, but it also comes within us and shines as light within us. I think it's important also to realize that Jesus also describes, I'm assuming it's in John's Gospel as well, that we are the light of the world too. In a sense, whatever light that Jesus has in us shines through us, and we become that light, like a miniature light in the world, representing Christ.
Yeah, this is just a little nerd out thing too, real quick. But the festival the Tabernacle Festival typically happened in the fall on the autumnal equinox. So it was the day where light and dark were at equals, and darkness was going to get more throughout the rest of the year. So right at that celebration, when it's just going to get darker from here on out, he's saying, hey, I'm the light of the world. I'm going to carry you through the darkness to the next year. Yeah. And it was like a harvest festival. So it's also, I'm going to provide for you through the darkness, even, like
through the winter.
Yeah. Like that great Psalm 23, even in the valley of the shadow of, it's probably darkness, not death, but in the darkness of the valley, or in the darkness of death, God will be with you to walk with you through that moment. So Jesus is offering that. I think that's a really cool little sort of social cultural touchstone from that season.
Yeah. And I do like light as this revelatory thing. So like as Armenians, we attribute the spreading of Christianity by a guy named Saint Gregory the Illuminator, who was in darkness in a dungeon for 13 years. And then when he got out, he was able to convert the king, and Armenia became the first Christian nation. And I love that they called him the Illuminator, the one who was in darkness. Yeah. And it's a promise from God to make sure that his people are in light and walk in light. And like when we say the Christmas greeting, it's like Christ is born and revealed is how you say Merry Christmas in the Armenian tradition. There's this revelatory understanding that Christ is revealing something of utmost importance. And if you experience what he reveals, you're participating with it.
I think it's also kind of language we're familiar with when we talk about enlightenment or being enlightened, right? We even name a certain history period, the season of enlightenment in Western culture. But it has to do just with that, with it being instructed, with it being opened up to a new way to be in the world. And I think that's crucial here. That's what Jesus is saying. Come to me, learn a new way. I'll reveal the way for you, and I'll reveal the darkness you're in at the moment. And it's okay. I'll walk with you through it, but don't ignore it. Don't be blind to it. I think that's actually if I'm remembering correctly, at the end of that story in chapter 9, where Jesus heals the blind man, he gets to the end of the story and he says, because you say you're not blind, you're condemned, you stand judged. But if you said you were blind, I would have been here to help you. So that's the criticism he has of the power elite. It's the fact that they refuse to see. It's not that they that they can't see, it's that they refuse to see. And so you can close your eyes to the light, but you can't stop the light from shining.
Yeah. I think they're being criticized for not recognizing that they're blind, basically. They're pretending they can see, and they're trying to lead others. It's the blind leading the blind kind of thing.
There you go.
But Jesus is saying, look, no, you should realize you're blind. It's because you say you can see, that's where there's trouble. And I think even going back to the idea of like Plato's cave kind of thing, like I like that analogy in a sense too. Like if you're in darkness for such a long time and you come out into the light, it's going to hurt your eyes, right? So you have this instant where you can decide, ouch, this hurts. I'm going to run back in my cave, or I'm going to just press on through. It's going to hurt for a little while, but then I'm going to be able to adjust and see and be able to live in that light. Yeah. So there's that momentary pain associated with things being revealed and the shining the light and living in the light. But if you press through to adjust and live in it instead of running away back in the cave, like, the Pharisees would probably do.
Yeah, that's the worst, when it's really dark and you flip the lights on after being in the dark for so long. Yeah. When I wake my daughter up in the morning and it's really dark and I flip the lights on, she kind of complains, like, oof. She actually says oof.
Nice.
She's that Armenian. She actually says oof. She says oof, Baba, light. So it hurts, right? It's not fun when you do that. But also I think we just take the privilege of having access to light for granted. I mean, like in the culture that this is written in, it's a pretty valuable thing to be able to have light. If you don't have the privilege of light, if you don't have the gift of light, then you're at danger and you can't really do much. You can't see.
Right, burning oil. It's an expensive thing to have that light at night. Right, it is a privilege and it is something that's costly.
Right. So I think something about this light of the world statement is to actually value the gift of God instructing us, God being our victory, God offering us a way to walk with him.
Yeah, I do like the phrase you mentioned, Shant, with like the blind leading the blind. And part of walking in the light is to acknowledge that we are blind or we are in darkness. And just like practically speaking, all three of us have counseled many people. And you cannot help someone who doesn't acknowledge step one, that there is a problem.
Right.
You can't help anyone if they don't realize there's darkness inside of them, and it manifests in many forms. It could be an addiction. It could just be a certain characteristic, vice. It could be so many things. But if the acknowledgement is not there, there's no chance for transformation. And
yeah, I think that's what. Oh, go ahead, Sean.
No, I said even when they do make that acknowledgement, I think the analogy I made is apt. Is that okay? There's going to be some pain. You're going to experience some discomfort, right? Okay, but it's going to be worth it coming out the other end, and that itself is a process.
Yeah, it just struck me as we're talking about this. Last week we were saying how that bread of life scene is like John's version of Eucharist and communion, and it's very likely that this chapter 8 and chapter 9 is John's version of what some scholars call the sort of unforgivable sin of Matthew's gospel. I think maybe Mark has it too, where he says, I can't heal you. I can't do anything if you guys don't listen, if you just keep denying, if you reject me. Like, so this posture of, in face of all of the facts, pure rejection and unwillingness to let the light in, it's just one of those things that you can't do something, like you can't do anything with somebody who's refusing to participate in that.
Yeah, and then walking through the steps of walking in the light after you acknowledge it. So right after Jesus says he's the light of the world, he says, if you abide in my word, you are my disciples.
Right.
And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free.
Right.
So there's something freeing about being in the light once we're there. It might hurt initially, but the end goal is to freedom.
Exactly.
I often talk about sin unashamedly. I believe there's right and wrong. We live in a society where people are like, how could you know we're good and evil? We've moved beyond that. Everything is more gray. But there is right and wrong. And it's hard to embrace this in this post modernistic worldview we're in. And oftentimes when I call things as sin, naming the darkness, people may think that I'm shaming them or I'm trying to guilt them, but good preaching doesn't guilt them or shame them. It's calling them to walk into freedom On the other side of confession is freedom. It's not additional guilt or additional shame. And this leitmotif is, all right, I want to put a spotlight on this problem, own up to whatever is the darkness is there, walk in the light. And if we abide in Christ and trust that, like, Christ has victory over darkness. This is not some higher knowledge thing. This is actually a concrete freedom of guilt and shame because of our sin. We trust him, we will find freedom.
Yeah, there's a term called gaslighting, where you shame somebody or you guilt somebody for the purpose of power.
Yeah.
To gain an advantage over them. This is not what we're talking about. We're not talking about gaslighting. We're not talking about creating shame so that you can hold people in place. We're talking about freedom, right? We're talking about owning up to our weaknesses, owning up to our inabilities, and owning up to our mistakes, and finding actually that those can be redeemed and used for healing for others. And the only way we'll be able to do that, as you said, is through the honesty, but also the remaining or the abiding that Jesus talks about. And that language of abiding, we don't use it anymore, but it's connected to the word abode. That's the English term we translated abiding from. And abode is a home, right? It's where you live, where you spend your days, right? And that's the key thing. Are you taking up residence? Are you walking with Jesus as your home? And is he the one you remain with throughout each moment of life? And that's what's going to ultimately give you not just the honesty, but the ability to take your weaknesses and use them for healing and life of others.
Yeah, I like the idea of home in a sense that, right now we live in the fallen world and there is darkness in the world. And we are trying to live in the light, in a sense, enemy territory in a lot of ways. And I like, what you guys are saying, that, light, and Jesus says, as the light is, not, like you said, not trying to shame, but light can't help but be light, right? Light can't help but reveal things. It's nature. It's what it's doing. There's no judgment there. It's what happens after the light reveals something, where we can make that progress in people's lives for the positive and to abide in it. But also, like you said, the home thing, it's that we're in this world, but it's not our ultimate home, right? I think light is such a big theme in John's gospel, from the beginning, from the middle, like you mentioned in 1 John, but also in Revelation, right? Another John written document. In Revelation, we are encountered with what God wants the new world to be like. We have a new creation, and in a new Jerusalem where there is no darkness. It's all light, because we are completely in God's presence, and it just all illuminated, no darkness at all. And that's the picture that we have. That's our ultimate home, right? That's where we will abide and live.
Right. And I think let's take that all together and package it together, because, I may have said this on the pod before, but I had a professor who used to say you can't understand the Gospels unless you understand Exodus, and you can't understand Exodus unless you understand Genesis. So it's this like 3-tiered situation. But so, in Genesis, the light is the creation, right? And God brings a new creation into the world. And then in Exodus, God is leading his people by the light into a new way, a new creation. And then in the Gospels, yeah, exactly. And in the Gospels, Jesus is the light of this new creation dawning in a new day. And the anticipation and the broad narrative of Scripture is that in Revelation, all of creation will be subsumed and renewed, and a new creation will, all of us will be led out into a new creation where life wins the day and love rules all things. So all of that comes back to Jesus here as the centerpiece, saying, I'm it. I'm the light leading you into that new day. And it's dawned. And even though the darkness is ahead of us, we'll walk through it in light.
Wonderfully put. I think we should end it there. This is coming from the Gospel of John. Don't just take our word for it. Read the Gospel of John if you're new to the Bible, or if you want to meditate on what does it mean that Jesus is the light of this world. And there's a lot of songs that are dedicated to this, a lot of poetry and imagery, but there's depth to this. And we're not just talking about higher truths here. We're talking about a concrete person. And I think that's important to stress while we talk about these analogies of who Christ is saying he is. So thank you, Shant, for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for just catching up and talking. Jeremy, great talking. Thank you to our listeners, and have a wonderful day. Take care, everyone.
Bye.